Well, good afternoon. This is the lecture on Chapter 5, and as I reminded you last week, I wanted you to read Chapter 6 before you read Chapter 5, because most of what we are discussing in Chapter 5, the foundation was laid for that in Chapter 6. So with that in mind, let me share my screen with you and we'll go over some of the things that I think it's important for you to know. Um, so make sure that you read chapter 6 before you read chapter 5, and make sure that you go over the lecture from chapter 6 and the lab or the chapter reading that came out later in the week, last week. So make sure you read those. Um, for Hobbes, as we learned last week, the predicament of human beings is that if we don't have rules, the state of nature happens. And he defines that state of nature as the war of all against all. That's how we started out. As a matter of fact, biblically, if you remember, early in Genesis, the brother kills the brother, Cain and Abel. So the 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 focus of society uh, with without the social contract is mayhem, the war of all against all. And in the state of nature, we implicitly, according to Hobbes, by existing in a society, give up some of our rights, some of our absolute rights for overall safety. Now, that is the essential requirement for government in Hobbes. As a matter of fact, if you read Adam Smith, who we learned about last chapter, who is a follower of Hobbes, you're going to find out that not only is that the essential requirement of government, it is probably the only true function of government. Everything else should be left to chance, more or less, what he called laissez-faire, to develop on its own. Now, when we come to Hobbes, we see in Adam Smith's economics, and we also see in consequentialism or utilitarianism, and let me remind you once again that those are just two names for the same topic. For Hobbes, for economic theory, for most of politics and economics in English-speaking countries, Hobbes is absolutely essential. He is the foundation of political theory and moral theory in English-speaking world. And that is probably the clearest example of the interchange of politics and philosophy or political philosophy that exists anywhere in any part of history. It's one of the few instances of the obvious cooperation between moral theory and politics. So it's essential for understanding American government, British government, however different they may be. They're still based upon these same principles. It's the foundation of consequentialism, the greatest good for the greatest number, at least in the early formulations of Bentham and the early John Stuart Mill. That's where we're going next, by the way. So you should definitely read chapter 7 for next week. Excuse me while I get up and turn on the light. It's getting a little dark. Okay, back. Sorry. Now, without this social contract, we will revert to the original state that we found ourselves in without the social contract, the state of nature where it is characterized by the war of all against all, where anarchy and mayhem rule. Now, there's a much earlier form of the Hobbesian argument found in two early dialogues of Plato, the Crito and the Apologia. The Apologia, we get our word apology from that, except in the Greek and the Latin, we kind of think of apology as, oh, I'm so sorry. But apologia in both Greek and Latin has a tendency of restating truths, giving a truthful account of something. Hence, the word apologia, again logia, restatement of the logical facts. So the Apologia dialogue gives account of the trial and conviction of Socrates. And in that dialogue, the founding rulers of the city of Athens have brought a charge of treason against Socrates because he is corrupting the minds of the youth. He's teaching them something that the city doesn't like. So they are having a trial of Socrates, and they gather the mob together, and the mob, of course, shouts for the death of Socrates. A mob gathers, demands his death. Now, Plato does not have a very high idea about democracy. Democracy does not prevent the rule of anarchy in Plato. It just leads to mob rule, which is in itself, of course, anarchy. So democracy does not prevent anarchy or tyranny in Plato. The only cure for that in Plato is teaching individual minds, individual people to be orderly, logical, rational, and structured. Socrates is condemned to death for teaching that truth was counter to the interests of the Athenian government, and they foment rebellion in order to demand his execution. So the Apologia is in defense of logic and truth, as opposed to tyranny, which is the natural state of governments. So Hobbes and Plato agree about that. Now, the disciples of Socrates urge him to accept banishment from Athens rather than death. And he imagines the laws speaking to him. Now, is he crazy? Well, there's some question about that. Is the poison gone to his brain already? But the argument here is that he's been raised so far and has benefited from the laws of Athens. So it's made him who he is, who's the most logical, intelligent person that ever lived. So it's not the fault of the laws. He's been raised and he's benefited from listening to these laws, and that is rational. The laws are rational. Now, the question here is, for a skeptic, I guess you might say, is has Plato in general, in specific, and Greek in general, been bewitched by the notion of law and the word in Greek? The word is nous, and it has a mental component to it that our word law doesn't. So law for the Greek mind, at least, was rational. So in many ways, Socrates is arguing for the truth of the definition of law. But it's not the laws who are to blame for this anarchy and mob rule, but individuals who misuse them for selfish purpose and to subvert the truth. So people are at base anarchists and addicted to self-interest. Hobbes and Plato agree about that, but they disagree about how that is solved. So people are addicted to self-interest, and we must rise above self-interest. Now, to some degree in Hobbes, we're grounded in self-interest. That self-interest can only become enlightened self-interest, where we realize that, hey, the gig's up here. If I don't give up a little something, I'm going to get killed. So we decide to sort of split the baby, I guess we might say. But we never give up on self-interest. As a matter of fact, that's based on self-interest, just enlightened self-interest. So it's still intoxication with self and narcissism being turned in on the self. Can't think about anything else but yourself. That perverts law. And the only way around that is to train and educate individual people to think clearly. In Plato, you can never legislate yourself into morality. You must reason yourself into morality. And the more rational people you have, the closer the society can become to a rational society. Hence, true law must be based upon philosophy and not self-interest. Now, there's the real key here as Plato begins to shift from these early dialogues to the middle dialogues like the Republic, where the rulers of the society become philosophers. Now, you might have anticipated that if we are to think ourselves back to our true needs, we need to think clearly about those true needs, and we need a philosopher and not an attorney or a politician to instruct us about our true needs, because it's basically self-reflection. Without self-reflection, we're never going to get to a meaningful society. So we must have those in place who urge us to tremendous self-reflection, to self-analysis, and not self-interest. Now, we still have some of this around. We talk about wise, we call them statesmen or statespeople, those who put the good of society or the good of the nation or the good of the world before themselves. And we consider them wise and erudite people, and we say we should listen to them. So we still have some of that. We still have some of that Platonic notion here. Even within our American, British, egoistic, Hobbesian structures, we still have some of that in place. Hence, for Plato, the law must be based upon philosophy and not self-interest. To base it on any sort of self-interest, enlightened or otherwise, is to dig ourselves deeper into the hole of anarchy. So there is a social contract, but one we might say with the personal betterment clause. That's the basis for successful government. And that's the difference between Plato and Hobbes. Both start with this notion of social contract, but one is based upon adherence to logic, and the other is based upon adherence to some less dangerous notion of self-interest. I'll leave it to you to think about which of those might be superior. And you'll need to think about that because I can almost guarantee that question might come up again. So, since we have already covered many of the things that we are covering in today's lecture, in both the lecture last week and the lab session on the chapter, I'm going to squish together the lecture and the lab session on chapter 5 for this week. So let's go through the book together now that we've finished the highlights of the chapter. The first thing you need to pay attention to is, why does society need moral rules? Of course, that should be clear by reading Hobbes, and to some degree by Plato, because as we said, both agree that people start out in an anarchic state. How we ameliorate that, or how we solve that, how we turn people, are quite different in both philosophers. Then he discusses Hobbesian morality and the Lord of the Flies. The book came out in the 1950s. There was a movie, 70s, 80s, 90s. I've lost track of time. But the subject of the Lord of the Flies, everybody's always assumed that innocent people, children, are basically good. So in order to investigate this, Golding, the author of The Lord of the Flies, has some children shipwrecked on an island. They're all children, so they should be innocent, right? Well, over the time of the novel, their innocence devolves into the sheerest sort of anarchy and horror. Now, we should know this, right? We've heard this story before. It's as old as Genesis, because in Genesis, the first book of the Torah, the Bible, um, brother kills brother. So right out of paradise, a murder occurs, fratricide, the killing of brother and brother. So we should know this. And Golding simply restates an old truth of Genesis. Then he discusses social order and the benefits of morality, connecting social order and morality. Then why should I be moral? And he tells the story of Gyges, G-Y-G-E-S, and police. You would be very wise to really get into that, go deep into that, because I can guarantee you there's at least one question on some exam someplace that's going to come back to haunt you if you don't know that. Of course, you should be moral in Plato, not out of self-interest, but simply because of reality. Don't be conformed to anarchy and self-interest and lack of self-control. Transform, bring back what is real. And that's why you should be moral in Plato, because it's reality, it's the truth. So think about that. Now, he goes into morality, self-interest, and game theory, and now I think you know why I asked you to play through several iterations of that computer game that I assigned last week in chapter 6. I want you to study what he says here about game theory and think about what you learned as you played through those games. And I hope you do learn things by playing games. I think you should. Else there's really no reason to play games, right? Okay. Now, then he discusses the modified principle of rational self-interest. And basically, that is kind of what we all do. We take, we can be Hobbesian all day long, but we do take licenses. We do a little bit more than the speed limit. Tell me you don't do it. We push that envelope just a little bit on income taxes, right? the little white lie, and we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Um, we push the envelope on truth here a lot. And that modified notion is that we need to at least appear to be moral in order to play the game and remain in society, which game theory then would support to some degree the Hobbesian notion of the social contract. We need at least to appear on the surface just the right amount to be engaged in the social contract. A little too much and people take advantage of you, right? But we play an artsy game. That's the whole idea here of the modified principle of rational self-interest. And then in conclusion, just let me read the conclusion. I know you can read, but this does go to sum up where we've started, where we're ending today. In this chapter, we have examined social contract theory's explanation of moral motivation as expressed in two questions. Why does society need moral rules, and why should I be moral? Hobbes argues that because humans always act out of perceived self-interest, people are naturally driven into conflict with everyone. That's the state of nature. The solution is for us to create a social contract. By giving up some of our liberty and adopting moral rules, we gain peace. Thus, the answer to the first question, why does society need moral rules, is that morality is a much needed mechanism of social control. Social contracts theory answers to the second, why should I be moral, is more complicated, as the game of cooperate and cheat, with a prisoner's dilemma, shows. Ultimately, I should be moral because by occasionally allowing some disadvantage for myself, I may obtain an overall long-term advantage. Even when it seems as though I can break moral rules without getting caught, I still need to consistently follow them because although an individual moral act may sometimes be at odds with my self-interest, the complete moral form of life in which the act is rooted is not against my self-interest. All right, that very well sums up Hobbes. And to that I would add the summation of the Platonic point is that only by being rational, only by bettering ourselves, increasing our intelligence, delving into the finer aspects of thinking, can we be sharp enough to make the decisions on an individual basis that corporately adding all rational minds together makes for a rational society. Hope that helps. And I hope that you will think about these things, read this chapter, play the games, and I will see you again next week when we discuss utilitarianism, consequentialism, John Stuart Mill, and Jeremy Bentham. I bid you a good afternoon and a good week, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.